Welcome to Crossword, where cultural clues lead to the truth of the word. And this is your intrepid host, Michelle McAloon. If you want to find out anything more about me, go to bookclues.com. And if you would be so kind to rate, review, subscribe, opine, all of that good stuff, it helps the algorithms. And I hope you enjoy listening to the show, and pour yourself a glass of champagne. God bless. All right, folks, today we have a very special treat. I like to think of it as a cocktail almost of a wonderful book. It is The Champagne Tales by Kate McIntosh. And this is a little bit off the usual genre you hear during Crossword, but I thought this would be a great Valentine story, a great Valentine book for any of you guys listening out there looking for a gift for your wife. And to start this book off, to start this interview off, I'm going to pour myself a little glass of champagne. There we go. Hopefully you can hear that in the background. Unfortunately, it's not Veuve Clicquot. It is because I couldn't find it here in Germany. I'd like to welcome the author, Kate McIntosh, who has written this wonderful, charming book, The Champagne Letters, put out by Simon & Schuster. Kate McIntosh, I love her biography. She's always in search of the perfect bottle of wine, a good book, and a swoon-worthy period costume drama. I love it. You'll find her in Vancouver, where in her free time she enjoys spending time with friends, teaching writing, and listening to true crime podcasts. And Kate, welcome to the show. And I have to ask you, do you drink champagne?
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here. And I've enjoyed listening to your podcast. And I know I'm not the usual fit, but I'm glad to kind of sneak in for this conversation.
Oh, well, this is a great book because you have a lot of history in your book. And one of the things I really enjoy about your book are the details you have about Parisian life. You've obviously well researched how champagne is made. You talk about food, you talk about method, and you set it against the backdrop of Napoleonic history, where Madame Clicquot, the Veuve Clicquot, actually made her champagne. So why don't we start from the very beginning? Why this kind of book?
Well, I think you put your finger on one thing, which is I've always been a bit of a history nut, and I grew up loving it, and I read a lot of nonfiction as well. But I find for a lot of people, and myself included, sometimes you also kind of want to sink into a story. So for me, historical fiction has always been that lovely blend of a chance to learn a lot of things at the same time of getting a great story that sort of surrounds it. So for me, it was a fun way to share all these details versus pinning you in a corner at a cocktail party and being like, did you know the history of champagne? This lets me do it in a perhaps a more socially acceptable way. It actually started, I had the chance, I lived abroad. So I lived in Belgium for a couple of years. And during that time, as anyone who's lived in Europe is aware, everything is so gosh darn travelable. You know, you could go from Brussels to Paris within just a few hours on the Euro train. So we had a chance to travel down to Epernay and to France. And I fell in love with the area. And I took a tour of the Veuve Clicquot Champagne house. And in that, at the time, it's actually rather funny because while I was a huge reader, I wasn't a writer at that time. I wanted to be, but I wasn't yet sort of fully writing my own books. But I wrote in my travel journal at the time, this woman would make an incredible character. And some 15, 17 years later, I would finally write that book.
Describe to our readers who is the Veuve Clicquot, and give us a name and her time period so we can kind of picture her.
Oh, I would love to. So first off, a lot of people may know this champagne. It's a fantastic champagne. It's got a bright yellow label that goes with it. And it's Veuve Clicquot. What people may not know is Veuve means widow. And that's a really good place to start because at that time in France, as well as in many other places in the world, women were not allowed to own their own business. Now, the exception was if she was a widow. So, one of the things that was, of course, happening during Napoleonic France is there were a lot of widows being unfortunately made at that time. So, you started to see more women moving into the vineyards and taking over. Just as you see in other times in history during war, women step up into occupations that they might not otherwise have done. So World War II had Rosie the Riveter. The Napoleonic War resulted in women moving out into the vineyards and into production and so forth. So Champagne and the widow, she was married. She was married to Francois Clicquot. He was a bit of a dreamer. He was a bit of how to describe Francois. He had a lot of big emotions by all account, and she was probably the more practical of the two in the business pair. And then when he passed away, she stepped up into that role. Now, when we see any pictures of her, she's usually pictured the most famous painting. She looks like she's about in her 70s. She's a bit heavy set woman with these big giant sausage curls. But what, of course, a lot of people realize is that was taken, obviously, that painting was created towards the end of her life. When she was starting the champagne field, she would have been in her 30s. She was a young mother and she was sort of taking this on. And I think what appealed to me was a little bit of that timeless quality of people stepping up when things are difficult. I have a wonderful aunt who has since passed away. And my Aunt Joan always used to say to me, difficult things aren't done by special people. Special people step up to do difficult things. And that always sort of stuck with me. Whenever I was going through something, she would be like, you're not the first or the last to deal with something difficult. You just have to do it step by step. Just do the next right thing. And so I think what appealed to me with The Widow is there was a woman who very easily could have stepped back. There was a lot of societal and family pressure for her to remarry. But she knew what she wanted to do, and she had a very clear vision for her wines. She was a huge innovator in the world of champagne. We can talk, if you like, about some of the changes that she made that significantly improved the product, and she took those steps to do what was needed, and I found that admirable, and I think for other women and for other readers, seeing someone tackle that is always an exciting read.
It is, and how you structure this story is very interesting because you use a pistolatory kind of format. So you have Madame Clicquot, or the Veuve Clicquot. Later in her life, she's at the very end of her life, actually, and she is a great grandmother, and she's writing to Anna, her granddaughter or great
Great
granddaughter.
great-granddaughter.
Okay, great granddaughter, and this is set against modern times. A woman named Natalie Taylor, right? Recently off a very fresh divorce. And actually, when she opens the book, she's still sort of going through the divorce and the emotions behind that. Why did you decide to do it like that? Because I think it's really interesting how you do it. You kind of mirror the two women. She draws strength from Veuve Clicquot, from Madame Clicquot.
Well, there's really 2 reasons. So, the first is I love in historical fiction when you see the dual timeline, as they'll call it. So, where there is one storyline in the present and one story in the past, and how they are in fact connected. So, I knew that I wanted to write about Veuve Clicquot and I wanted to tell her story. And I knew I wanted to have someone learning from that story. Now, on the other end of that, I actually went through my own divorce. So at that time, we had just planned for my 50th birthday and for our 25th anniversary, we had planned a trip to France when, in fact, everything came out and our marriage blew up. So as a result, I went on our 25th anniversary trip on my own. So, unlike the character in the book who also runs off to France, I didn't have nearly quite the adventures that she did.
Okay.
I mostly ate my body weight in cheese and did a little bit of sniveling and crying as I walked around on my own. But part of what I found through the process of travel, and I am a huge proponent of travel as a way that we can learn and grow both about other worlds and also about ourselves. So, one of the things that happened while I was on this trip to France for myself was I reminded myself, like, I can do this. I can do things on my own. And I course, was drinking a lot of champagne while I was in France. And that reminded me again of the widow. And I think for a lot of people, when you're going through any type of difficulty, we can learn so much from people in history. We're not the first to go through difficult times. Even if
Absolutely.
you
Right.
look at the politics that are happening now and people's various issues with that, yes, it feels dark. Yes, it feels difficult, but we don't have to blaze a brand new trail. There have been people who have bushwhacked through this before, and we can learn so much by following in those footsteps or by what we can learn from those people. So for me, the widow was one of those people that I reminded myself her life had impact by what she did after she lost her husband, not before. And so for me, it was that reminder of I can do things. I just need to find my own particular path.
And you did. You went and wrote a book,
I wrote a
very
book.
good book. A successful, very successful book, a wonderful book. You kind of do a conversation, and in these letters that she is writing to her granddaughter, there's a lot of wisdom in these letters. And now that I know that your experience, I see how you drew from that experience and put these into the letters. And it's not hard to imagine because of the times that she was in, because of her conditions, she had to be very strong. And you portray her as giving the wisdom of strength. And it really works well.
One of my favorite quotes in the book is something that wasn't directly told to me, but it's something I believe very strongly, which is strength is not a fixed state. That is, they're not strong people and weak people. Strength is a series of decisions that people make. and
Right.
and that comes to me, I have a very dear friend who unfortunately lost her son in this past year. And
I'm sorry.
one of the things that she talked about is how many people came to her and said, "Oh, you're so strong. I don't think that I could get through that." And she said to me, like, I don't have a choice. Like, this is the situation that I am faced with. And when you look at someone like the widow Clicquot, she was dealing with several different things. There was the death of her husband. There was a business that was on the financial brink for a very long time. She was eventually extraordinarily successful, one of the most successful entrepreneurs, probably still. But certainly in the initial days, it wasn't smooth sailing. Then you kind of layer in there's the Napoleonic War that's going on at the same time, and all of the challenges that were happening with winemaking. It's difficult to make wine when there are troops moving in and out of the fields where you grow wine, where there are tariffs and challenges that are presented with exporting or importing different products. So she was having to problem solve during all of that, and it was a series of decisions. And I think what's important is not all of those went well. She took a big gamble at one point and smuggled a bunch of her wine out into Amsterdam with the idea that they would get it out into the market. And just with the timing, with the ships, almost all of that exploded on the dock. So wine bottles at the time were under a lot of pressure. Champagne is still under a lot of pressure.
Hmm.
But the glass making certainly wasn't as refined as it is now. And they had massive explosions, and basically the entire shipment was destroyed. And it was almost the end of the champagne house.
And doing some research about her too, and about a little bit about more about champagne, I didn't realize what she came up with. She was really, I mean, she really transformed the champagne industry from learning to turn it a point, to turn it upside down, to get the what is that called? The yeast
Please.
out of it.
Yeah.
Yes, okay, the yeast out to the remuage, the shelves that you put the champagne in. I didn't realize that she was one of the first to come up with rosé champagne too, and she came up with they call it a millésime, a single vintage, a single grape. This was a woman on the move.
She was an amazing entrepreneur. And when I went to France for the very first time, when I lived back there, and we toured the Champagne region, and you try champagne, and we think of it as such a fixed product, that this is, of course, the way champagne looks. This is the way that champagne tastes.
Right.
This is the way that champagne is made. And when you go down into the cellars, they're delightful cellars. So they're carved into this limestone that is throughout the region. They have this wonderful sort of sweet, musky aroma. When you go down, it almost makes you hungry. And you see these racks and racks of wine, and they look like sort of Egyptian pyramids. So they're sort of tilted towards the center, all the bottles with the bottom sticking out. And under the traditional champagne method, you see fellows, they're called riddlers, who go along and they turn the champagne, each bottle, a slight amount each day. And by turning that just ever so slightly, it moves the yeast down into the neck of the bottle where it's eventually disgorged. And we just think of that as, well, isn't that so sweet and old fashioned? And of course, and now in many places that's done with machines. And any sparkling wine will have that yeast in the bottle because it's the second fermentation that makes the wine bubbly. But of course, what a lot of people don't know is if you don't get that yeast completely out, you run the risk that the wine can go what they call ropey. And that's a very nice term for what it is. It's about the consistency of sort of a loose egg white. It looks a
Ugh.
bit like pond water. You'll see these long, almost like algae-like strings that come up from the bottom of the bottle. It's completely vile. It's completely undrinkable. And this happened a lot in early champagne because before she came up with this process of turning the bottles upside down and doing what they call disgorgement to get it all out, the only way that you could get the yeast out was from pouring from bottle to bottle. So they
Right.
would
Yeah.
try to
Wow.
just sort of if you've ever had a bottle of wine that had a little bit of, so in red wine, sometimes you'll see that sort of jammy scent, and you're sort of ever so carefully trying to keep that from coming out. Imagine doing that on a large scale as a
Right.
part of
Sure.
production. It was a mess, and it cost certainly bubbles, and it cost product, and it was very expensive, and it often didn't work. So this was a huge step forward in terms of quality control. And she was never satisfied. I mean, this was a woman who was constantly looking at the different blend of grapes that could be done. She was looking at whether or not you could do a single year vintage. She was looking at how to constantly improve the bottles that were used, the shipping methods that were used, anything to sort of do this. And it was really under her that champagne became this hugely popular drink. And you would hear in England in the early 1900s, people would be yelling out, "Give us the Widow, give us a bottle of the Widow." And it was because her shame was so ubiquitous and so many people just knew it as this high quality product. Certainly now that, there are many, and I, of course, tragically had to do an in-depth study of all the
Of
different
course you did. Of
champagnes. It
course, you
was
poor thing. Right.
it was it was a difficult thing. It was tax deductible, no less, but I did my part so that you don't have to, where I tried
Suffering for your
multiple.
art. That's
It was
right.
difficult, and I was very lucky. There's a wonderful store here called Everything Wine, where they have a sommelier on staff who teaches various classes and did a class actually on different sparkling wines because champagne is made in the Champagne region of France, but there are multiple sparkling wines, many of which are made in the same methods of champagne. They just can't call themselves champagne. And I think a lot of them owe the debt of their gratitude to entrepreneurs and innovators such as the Widow.
Absolutely. And I was recently in Epernay on a wine tour, and, it's something that kind of thunderstruck me. I've always thought of champagne and then wine. And the vintner that I was talking to said, "No, Michelle, this is wine. We're making wine. We're not, the method makes champagne, but we're making wine." And I thought, huh, I never, I never really thought of that. And what's interesting now, I just did a tour and there are a lot of women owners of, especially of your small house champagnes, a lot of women owners. In one of your characters wants to open up a wine store, a women's owned, or and the story evolves, but a wine store. And I've seen a couple of those now come through Epernay and through Ron's. So I thought that was really interesting.
Well, and certainly it's a very exciting time in general for wine and for women-owned businesses, and I think you're seeing that there's some wonderful things happening in California. I read an article and ended up trying a bunch of wines with women entrepreneurs in the sort of region in Napa and Sonoma Valley, sort of doing that. In Canada, where I live, you're also seeing the growth of more and more women either taking over businesses, so family-run businesses, or striking out on their own. And there's just some really exciting things that are happening in wine. I think one of the things that's so enjoyable about wine is it is, if you're going to choose to learn about anything, why not choose to learn about something as much fun as wine? If
Sure.
you're going to, if you're going to go down a rabbit hole, this is a lovely rabbit hole to be in. Um,
That's great.
and if you really do it, I mean, yes, of course, and there are people who are wine snobs and are very persnickety about wine. But the truth is that wine is very accessible, and people who are really passionate about wine will always tell you it's what you love, it's what you enjoy. My dad always jokes, my dad's in his 80s, and he always says his favorite vintage is Tuesday box wine. And that's what he likes, right? Like
It works. It works.
and if that's what he likes, that's what he should drink. And one of the rabbit holes that I went down for the book was the fact that it can be very easy to fool people who get ideas about wine. There's a wonderful nonfiction book called The Billionaire's Vinegar that is all about wine fraud. So there is a whole element of people who will buy and trade in wine that is actually counterfeit. And I think that happens because people kind of get set up. You have someone who's swirling a glass and saying things like, I get honeysuckle, I get this. And someone else thinks,
Right, right.
I smell grape juice. I don't understand what I'm missing. It smells like
Right.
wine. And so they feel intimidated. And so it can be very easy for people to be convinced that something is something that it isn't. And so that for me was another very interesting and fun sort of research rabbit hole to go down. And the character in the present day learns a lot about sort of wine fraud and what can happen in those areas and how easy it is to be convinced something is something that it is not.
Absolutely. And you do a great job showing that through the story. It is juxtaposed against the widow she takes risk, but and she learns her place, but she always has a sense of confidence about her. Even when times are bad, of just that faith in the future of just plowing forward and wherever she's being challenged. I think persistent would be the word, right?
I think she is comfortable with the idea of failure. And I think that is, again, one of the things I enjoy about your podcast is the idea of when you really look at a lot of these figures in history that we admire or that we, look to, we always tend to think of their high point. So we think of this time when they excelled in something or when they triumphed over something. And we forget the series of failures that led to that triumph.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
we just tend to we gloss over it because of course the real story, the fun part of the story is and then they triumphed over all. And so it's the winning battle, it's when the country gets founded, it's when the business becomes a success, it's when the battle turns. But we forget that there were all these series of things where things did not go well. And I think what I enjoy and admired in The Widow, as well as what I've enjoyed in other historical figures that I've looked to over the times, is they are people who fail, but then get back up. Certainly
Absolutely.
one of
Yeah.
the classic stories that comes up every so often is when they talk about Abraham Lincoln and the amount of
I knew you were going to say
failure.
Abraham Lincoln. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
He's
absolutely. He
impossible not to
is.
think of, where it was like, and then that didn't go well, and then he lost that election, and then that didn't go well, and realizing that, of course, that what made him Abraham Lincoln wasn't what he accomplished. It is that he kept getting up to accomplish those things. And, if there was something that I could impart to other people, or certainly something that I wanted to come through in the book, is that you will get knocked down. And I think sometimes we think we're special. I know, for example, when my divorce happened, I was sort of gobsmacked of like, but this shouldn't have happened to me. Like, it's not that I didn't know other people got it. I just didn't think it would happen to me. And
Right.
coming to realize, like, well, there's nothing special about me. There was nothing special about the widow. There's nothing special about anyone who has to face a difficult time. The challenge is, will you get back up when life knocks you down? Not whether or not life will knock you down. It almost certainly will. So the
Right. Yeah,
question
absolutely.
is, are you going to get back up? And the present day character, that is the lesson that she is taking from the widow. And certainly, I believe at the end of the book, what you see is someone who has learned to have confidence in herself. Not that she will do everything right, because she won't. Not that she won't make mistakes, because she will, but that when she makes mistakes, that she will be competent and capable to face the outcome of those.
Kate, magnificent, absolutely magnificent. I have to ask you, how did you do this research? And you, in your epilogue, you give several kind of resources, but I mean, you really, there's some great research here. Besides taking the wine tours, how, how did you do your research?
Well, it's interesting because I was quite daunted for a very long time. I was trying to write various different things, and I loved the idea of writing historical fiction, but I found it very intimidating. And I have read historical fiction, and I also read a large amount of historical nonfiction or narrative nonfiction. And I was terrified, and I decided to do basically what the widow would say, was like, just give it a start. And so I actually started, there's an absolutely remarkable biography called The Widow Clicquot by Tiliar Mazzeo, which is an
Okay.
excellent book that is the biography of the widow Clicquot. So I started with that. If you see my copy, you'll see there's a million different post-it notes and various things sticking out of that book. And I started with very simple things. So I just created a timeline of her life. I used to work as a therapist. So I worked for over 20 years as a therapist. And one of the things you learn as a therapist is it's not what happens to you in your life, it's the story that you tell yourself about what happens. So I
Hmm.
first started with, what are the major events that we know happened in her life that are part of sort of her biographical record? And then I started to think, what is the story that I believe she told herself about what those events meant? I was very lucky in that I wrote a letter off to the Champagne House and indicated that I wanted to write this book. And while they would have been very appropriate to just say, well, that's lovely for you. Good luck. There
Right.
was
Sure.
someone who reached out to me from there, a woman named Isabel, who's in charge of sort of their heritage foundation. And she was an endless source of a point person. So I would call her up and ask her questions for things that I couldn't find. And then we live in such a remarkable time. I'm old enough that I remember card catalogs, and I remember chasing through the stacks of libraries to find information out. And now we live in this remarkable time where you can just literally start, while still in your pajamas, sitting on the sofa, and stick something into your Google search bar and start the process and figuring out. I'm always amazed at what people are willing to share. And I'm sure you find this in your podcast because you have this opportunity
Absolutely.
to talk to all these fascinating people. But one of, the rabbit holes that I went down at one point is I was writing a scene and I was like, she strode down the vineyard and then slipped the envelope into her pocket. And then I stopped with my finger over the keyboard and I'm like, would she have a pocket? Were there pockets? I don't
Sure.
even
That's a great
I
detail.
I
Yeah.
have no idea if there are pockets. Is it only women in present day who are like, "Behold, it has pockets?" So I ended up reaching out to the local university, and there was a person who taught a class in clothing through the 17 and 1800s, and I reached out, and this person was endlessly passionate to be like, "I'm so excited to tell you about the role of pockets and underwear and buttons and how things work." And for me, the challenge in historical fiction was deciding what details to leave in versus going down the rabbit hole. So, one example that I can give, because I couldn't not leave it in the book and I had to kind of work around it, is one of the details I came across was Of course, during the Napoleonic War, they had conscription, or basically a draft where they were bringing people up
Right.
and you had to fight in the service. And probably much like any other time, initially there's a huge outpouring of patriotism. You see a lot of people sort of signing up. And as a war slogs on and the realities of war start to really come in, you see a lot of people being like, I think I'd rather not go and do that. I'd rather stay here and take care of my home and my family. And so, one of the primary ways that people opted out of being conscripted is that they would knock out their front teeth. Because at the time, in order to load a weapon, you had to tear the paper cartridge with your teeth, and then you would pour the powder into the gun, and then that would prime the gun, and they would. So you would see all these people who suddenly didn't have front teeth because it became a way to get out of the service. And
Wow.
I stuck that there's a line in the book where that she's walking along and she talks about some of the people in her village that are missing teeth and who are claiming, oh, I slipped and I fell and I unfortunately lost my teeth. But it was a well-known draft dodging sort of way to get around that.
Very interesting. And the people that you bring in and out of the widow's life and also Natalie Taylor's life, they're very well positioned to tell the story. Margot the mouse, and I mean, you've got some great ways of pulling the story out of it. And your great detail about Sabrage using the sword to open up the champagne bottle, which the French today still think it was the Napoleon when the Russians came in to do that. And who is the psychic that Josephine Bonaparte goes to, and they share the psychic, but you also keep your Catholicism. And I love that healthy dose of you don't dismiss the Catholicism in the widow's life, and because it was a historical fact for her, and at that time it would be weird if it was not.
I love, well, I think history is fascinating with the bigger, larger than life characters, but also the small everyday characters. And I wonder if, someone's writing historical fiction about 2025 in the year 2095, and they'll be talking about baristas, and someone will be on whatever the equivalent is a podcast saying, like, oh, it was so neat. They had these little baristas. And it'll
Yeah,
be
that's
something
true.
that
Probably, yeah.
it didn't exist. But, the widow has all these people in her life. She has Louis Beau, who is the salesperson, who was a true person that was in her life and was very involved with her as sort of they weren't partners in business. She was his supervisor. She ran the business, but he was certainly someone that she turned to quite often and was very involved with and very much respected his opinion. The psychic, as you mentioned, is a real character. And just like today, I think there's often this blend with what we say and then what our interests are. So we may say that we're a total skeptic, but we still toss the salt over our shoulder. And certainly it seemed to me very reasonable that the widow who was Catholic, who by all accounts actually got married in secret because she got married during the French Revolution when religion was pretty much verboten. They got married in secret, actually in the cellars beneath the city, so that they could have a Catholic ceremony. I still believe that she would be willing to pray for a good outcome, but also open to finding out whether or not a psychic had any inside information that might also be helpful.
Sure, why not? I mean, what
Keep that
why
door
not?
open. You never know.
Keep that door open. Okay, I've gotta ask you one little Easter egg for the potential reader. Do you own a green emerald ring?
I do not, but I do own a sapphire ring.
Okay,
And
I just wanna leave that one there. I Now tell me, you said that this is book has been very popular amongst book clubs. Tell us a little bit more about that.
well, first off, I'm thrilled. I've been in book clubs for years, and there are a few things that I enjoy more than a book club, in part because I think we all default to our certain comfort level of what we enjoy reading. And so we want to read more of those types of books. And book clubs are a great way where suddenly someone else in the book club, it's their turn to recommend a book, and you have a chance to discuss something that you might not otherwise have picked up. And this book has, knock wood, been very popular so far with book clubs. And I think that is for two reasons. One, it gives you a great theme. If you want to throw a party and have some French food and some French wines and some French champagne, why not do it while discussing a book about France and champagne
Sure,
and all
of
of the things
course.
that go with it? And I do think there are a lot of things that are resonating, probably particularly with women, but with readers in general, around starting over and finding strength at different times. And these are both characters in some ways that are women of a quote unquote certain age. And I think there's sort of a resurgence for people wanting to have discussions about that. Now, I have, if people are interested, if they reach out on my email, I do have a list of book club or book discussion questions that can be a jumping off point if people like that. And I also did make a list of champagne cocktail recipes, including the history. So I did put the history of, where the mimosa comes from, where the French 75 comes from,
Oh, yes.
which is lovely because there's some fun the French 75 actually comes from the French 75 Howitzer, which was a gun during World War One because it packed quite a wallop, as does the cocktail if you're so
Yeah, it
inclined to
does. It does.
give it
I've been
so
a
it has
victim. I've been a victim of
a
French
victim of a
75.
few of those in my past. So it has the history of some of the cocktails as well as some recipes. So hopefully people can have some fun with sort of trying those out.
Well, that's great. Well, Kate, I thank you so much for taking time. I know out of probably a very busy schedule. I cannot recommend this book enough. It would be, gentlemen, if you're listening to this, it would be a great gift for the ladies in your life for Valentine's Day. And also, I actually think men would enjoy reading it because it is about history. Who doesn't enjoy reading about champagne? I mean, come on.
It's hard to go wrong.
It's
What are you going to do? It's an endless cycle of fun.
Absolutely, absolutely, and it's The Champagne Letters by Kate McIntosh, and it's a Simon& and Schuster, publication, and all I have to say is à votre santé.
Merci. Thank you so much for having me.
Okay.